Interestingly enough, in those standards, which are law in Australia, they decided that they would make a responsibility on these taxi booking companies or networks that our accessible taxis needed to have the same response times as our conventional taxis. So in terms of the standards, they could have told us how many wheelchair accessible taxis we needed. They could have told us what proportion of the fleet needed to be wheelchair accessible. They just described it in terms of an outcome. Make sure your service is exactly the same as you're delivering with your conventional fleet. That's pretty hard to do. However, and sorry about the slide there, that means for us that in terms of our minimum service levels delivered by the conventional fleet, where we've got to have 85% turning up within 10 minutes, that's the standard for our wheelchair accessible fleet. None of this ring the day before, ring an hour before. If you ring up for a cab and you're in a wheelchair and you want that wheelchair accessible cab to turn up immediately, we've got 10 minutes to get it there in off-peak times. And the Queensland stats at the moment are that we, in 2005-06, we were somewhere around about 67%. It's obliterated by that orange arrow that I put on there, but we're now up around about two-thirds, just a tick under 75% are turning up within 10 minutes in off-peak times. And 89% are turning up within 20 minutes. We think that's probably world's best practice, but again, I'd be happy to hear from any jurisdiction that's doing better than that. And in peak times, they're the stats as well. In terms of the what we've got to turn up with, it's not like London where we can turn up with a vehicle that's can meet 30-35% of the people in wheelchairs. Like America, some of our folk in wheelchairs and using mobility scooters get quite large. And so our standards are pretty similar in metrics to the ones that are over in the ADA. Now, in making sure that we can service that demand, just a few stats to get your minds thinking. 1 to 2% of our demand is for a wheelchair accessible taxi. So how do you deliver the same service to 1 to 2% of demand? And what proportion of the taxi fleet should be wheelchair accessible. Our wheelchair accessible taxis do multiple jobs. So typically they're a van, they can do high occupancy work, so they can do transport up to about 10 or 11 people at a time. They can do standard cab work, which is what they predominantly do. And to do the wheelchair accessible work, it's probably 1 to 3 jobs per day, per wheelchair accessible taxi. In my home state, we're achieving those results that I pointed out before with about 19% of our fleet as wheelchair accessible vehicles. We're not all that keen on ramps, albeit in some states like New South Wales, ramps and rear entry vehicles are the predominate. They're mostly vans that deliver wheelchair accessible taxis. In my home state, we prefer to see hoists, similar to the one on the screen there. In terms of government initiatives to support wheelchair accessible taxis, I'm pleased to say that the various state governments around Australia have done some significant things. And there's a lifting fee paid to the driver, recognising the fact that loading a wheelchair into a cab takes longer than a conventional vehicle. In Victoria, where Gary comes from, they've been wise enough to recognise that sometimes those wheelchair accessible cabs, because they're a smaller proportion of the fleet, they'll have to run further to pick up the customer, and it might be for a short fare, and so they pay a run to customer fee. They also recognise the fact that in dispatching those jobs it takes longer, and so the government intervenes to pay for the dispatching of wheelchair accessible jobs as well. We have a taxi subsidy scheme recognising that eligible people may need to some assistance, so 50% of the fares are paid by the government. That's not really a subsidy to the industry, that's a subsidy to people in wheelchairs. Similar to Chicago, in Sydney there's a 0200 number, so all of the wheelchair accessible cabs, irrespective of the fleet that they're affiliated with, run off the same call number. And in Queensland and Western Australia, then there's quotas. If you've got a wheelchair accessible taxi licence, you're expected to deliver those, give a preference to wheelchair accessible jobs, and consequently there are quotas that you have to meet. There's also a cheaper medallion price associated with that condition on a wheelchair accessible licence. So in my home state, conventional licence, as we talked about before, would cost $415,000. A wheelchair accessible licence will cost probably about $195,000. Still a significant amount of money. And of course, thank you for that. A wheelchair accessible licence with an owner driver condition would cost something in the order of about $150,000. Safety, pretty much most of the same stuff that you've seen over here. I've put credit cards on there. That's a very significant thing for us. We've been doing that for about the last 25 years and does make it significantly cheaper for drivers, makes them less of a risk for robbery. And just in terms of non-traditional stuff, things outside of our comfort zone, we've got luxury taxis, so rather than having the black car industry separate to the taxi industry, it's actually incorporated. So you pay a surcharge for a better class of taxi where it's booked. High occupancy vehicles, so we get into the larger groups, taking them. We've got a thing that's called Night Link, which is a flat fare type arrangement, off ranks at night. It's non-exclusive and it's an upfront payment arrangement. We've got a thing called Council Cab, where local governments substitute taxis for the bus services. And effectively the passenger gets in, they book it the day ahead, they pay the equivalent of a bus fare, the cabbie puts the meter on at the beginning of the fare, collects 3 or 4 people, and the local government makes up the difference between the aggregate of those taxi bus fares that the driver collects and what the meter would say. And we've got a thing called personalised public transport, which is where a local government will commission a taxi company to run a pseudo bus service on a restricted schedule, and consequently blurring the lines between scheduled bus services and taxi services. And they're my contact details.
We have somebody who I believe has done a tremendous service for the industry and also for the ITR, who has joined us to say a few words about closed systems. He actually just came back from Australia, and I think we're going to Australia next year, but we also have I don't believe him, but he claims he's retiring at the end of the year. Victor basically created the black car industry in New York City, came to Chicago and created the first black car company in Chicago, and really is the grandfather of the industry despite how young he looks. I still don't believe he's going to retire. People are taking bets on it, but he has done so much, not just for New York City and Chicago, but really around the world. He's traveled. He's now the president of the Taxi, Limousine, and Paratransit Association. And I think between Al Lagasse and Victor, IATR, I think, owes a debt of gratitude to him because, you know, the TLPA, which used to be known as the ITLA, had kind of an adversarial relationship with ITR, and it was really because of Victor's efforts before he became president, where he consistently, with Al, came to the ITR, tried to develop a dialogue over the years to the point where we were working well together. That it's really, it's to your credit and to Victor's credit. And so I think ITR owes you a debt of gratitude, and we hope you will continue coming to our conferences for years to come, now that you hopefully will be enjoying your retirement. But you are a wealth of information and inspiration to many, and we thank you for your years of service, Victor.
First of all, thank you all. I don't know how to follow that introduction, but what I will say is, having been in Australia just about a week and a half ago and being with Blair, and I went over there to give a talk over there as well, I found that country to be fascinating. I found the people to be extremely warm and you know, not to take anything away from Chicagoans, but and the organization, but I had a great time over there, and my wife and myself were taken in as though we were long-lost relatives. So I really had a great time, and I appreciate it. I don't have to go into the introduction on this. This is my stuff in there?
Yeah, should be.
Okay.
No, it's not loaded.
It is loaded?
It's not loaded?
Not loaded? Okay. All right. Then I'll just read. That's fine. My opening paragraph was to introduce myself. Matt did a wonderful job of doing that. I'm going to address two very important issues topics, and one of which is regulation versus deregulation, and the other is the industry that Matt pointed out, which is very near and dear to my heart, the black car industry in New York. Just let me give you just, I know I'm taking, a little bit of time away from Ireland, but I was over there 2 years ago, and that's fine. So, just let me give you a brief understanding of the black car industry and, how it came about in New York. The taxi industry is very heavily regulated in New York and has been. Actually, it's been a closed industry since 1937, the year of my birth. And for the next 50-odd years, it was, there were 11,787 yellow cabs in the city of New York, and that was dictated by state law. So there was no other avenue in the for-hire industry that was available to New Yorkers. Now, New Yorkers and the regulators and legislators at that time were looking for something where they could provide New Yorkers with a means by which they could more or less be a part of the rest of the country, because in the rest of the country you can call a yellow cab. In New York you can't call a yellow cab. New York City, that is. You can only hail a yellow cab on the street. So they began a pilot program in the 60s, the early 60s, that wound up, this is the longest running pilot program I ever knew in my life, wound up running for 20-odd years. In the early 60s, the police department regulated the taxi industry in New York, and what the city did was say, okay, you could put radio dispatching in the yellow cabs, you could put roof lights on the tops of the cars to say that they were on a radio call, and thereby you could allow people in New York to call for a yellow cab. Well, like I say, it lasted for about 20-odd years until one day, Ed Koch, God bless him, got up one morning and said, that's the end of the program, and just put a stop to it. But in putting a stop to it, he mandated that all the radio dispatching come out of the yellow cabs at that time and said, okay, you can start another industry, and just allowed the black car industry to begin. And subsequent to that, what happened was they began regulating the different segments of the industry. So in other words, from the yellow cab industry, then there became the black car industry, the livery industry, the limousine industry, and then others followed, shuttles and the like. So that's sort of like the genesis of the black car industry. And Matt said, I'm the father of it, grandfather of it. I have a few grandchildren, but whatever whatever label you want to put on me, I was very much involved in getting it up and getting it started, getting it off the ground, and it's very much a part of my history in the industry. And having been in the industry now for 50-odd years, it's true. I'm retiring. Anyway, let me talk about the regulation versus deregulation. And what I'm going to speak on is those who might not know, there was a trial back in the 70s and 80s regarding regulation versus deregulation, and it was deregulation and then subsequent re-regulation. First, there was the promise of deregulation. And what was the promise of deregulation? Lower fares, higher quality of service. Mind you, this was only the promise. Diversification of services offered, expanded service areas, particularly in low-income neighborhoods, opportunities to succeed or fail based on the individual's abilities, and the administration of the industry, all right, okay, to be easier and less costly. Let's move this ahead. Okay, there we are. And we'll go to the next page. Okay. Then we saw the reality of taxicab deregulation. What was the reality of it? Fares jumped dramatically. An average of 29% in the first year, between 60 and 70% over the first 3 years, and over the time, the fares remain higher than other comparable city taxicab rates. Service quality deteriorates, older vehicles, short trip refusals, decline in neighborhood service, overcrowding at airports, and other major trip generators such as downtown hotels. There's virtually no diversification of services offered. There's virtually no expansion of service area.